Hi, my name's Sam. I'm 16 years old and I've written one entire fantasy novel, a few short stories, short films, and tons of other stories throughout my life. And in this video, I wanted to share with you how I personally structure my stories. Just a quick note, I am in fact in my house. I'll be filming in my backyard once it gets a little warmer. It's just a little too cold out there. Okay, so jumping into structuring stories, one thing that I want to say right off the bat, this is the process that works for me, but that does not necessarily mean that it will work for you. I've designed this video and the script of this video to hopefully not necessarily give you a concrete way of this is how you do it, you have to have this, this, and this, not like a checklist of things, but rather just a way to think about structuring stories that I think will help you break out of that writer's block box that you might be in when you're trying to structure your story. So there's a lot of structuring ideas already out there. There's the hero's journey, the 3-act structure. There's all sorts of other stuff. You can just look up online, structuring, how to structure stories, and there will be tons of different methods that pop up. But there's a problem that I find with like 98%. So I find that one of the main problems with the hero's journey or the 3-act structure or other similar structuring methods in storytelling is that it feels like as a writer, you're in a box. And everybody says, think outside the box. Well, it feels like these methods are trying to put you in a box. It's just, you have to keep by this strict framework of 3 acts, or of the familiar world and the unfamiliar world, if you're familiar with the hero's journey. Just these like strict ways of thinking. And what my method aims to do is break out of that mold, allow you to think creatively and outside the box, because really, if you're just thinking inside the box when you're writing your stories, you're going to have a rough time like creating something original and creating something exciting. Good stories think outside the box. And so this method is just hopefully an outlet for writers like me and yourself to think outside the box and allow ourselves to develop ideas that are outside of the traditional hero's journey 3-act structure and still write a good, entertaining, and valuable story. So my method, which I've named the pin and string method, will hopefully help you break out of that mold and structure your story in a way that feels natural and a way that creatively fulfills you while also still being a valuable and entertaining story. One thing that is fundamentally true across the human race is that we all enjoy progress. We get dopamine rushes when we experience progress or positive changes, whether it be in ourselves or our environment or a story we're consuming. Me personally, I really enjoy watching numbers go up. That's just me. Like my word count, for example, while I'm writing something, that simple illustration of progress gives me dopamine rushes. And so this idea that humans enjoy progress is the whole idea behind storytelling. We as humans enjoy consuming stories because they are a way for us to feel that progress. Moving forward in a story is what makes a story satisfying, entertaining, or exciting. So when you're structuring your story, having that in the forefront of your mind and understanding that the fundamental building block of storytelling is the progress that you have driving you through that story, that will help you a lot when you're structuring your story, because that's the fundamental reason why we as humans enjoy stories. So if you have that in the forefront of your mind while you're structuring your story, you have a huge advantage. So how can we use this knowledge to write better stories? Well, first let's talk about the many different types of progress within storytelling. I've narrowed it down to 5. I'm sure there's others. All of these 5 have like sub-branches and subcategories, but these are the 5 types, in my opinion, of progress that you can find in a story and that every story should have in one form or another. The first is character progress. This is pretty self-explanatory. This is often referred to as character arcs. At the beginning of the story, a character is one way, and at the end of the story, a character is another way. This is particularly satisfying for us humans because we see ourselves in characters, and we want ourselves to make progress. Every day we wake up, we want to try to do something to progress ourselves forward. Whether that happens or not, we still have that drive to do it. And so seeing other characters make those changes, positively or negatively, to be honest, can be really satisfying because It's progress happening in front of our eyes that we can easily relate to because it's a human character or human representative of a character. You could even have a talking animal, right? That's a very common example, but still having character arcs and having that character progress throughout the story can be very, very satisfying for an audience. So that's the first type of progress. Second type of progress is plot progress. This one's also pretty self-explanatory. The hero's journey and 3-act structure will oftentimes talk about how every story has a problem to solve. And I kind of agree with this, kind of don't. I think it's a very limiting way of thinking, but I do agree with every story needs some kind of conflict or problem or obstacle to get over. So plot progress is simply the idea that as they're moving towards that solution, they're making plot progress. So the solution to the problem or the obstacle that the characters are trying to get over, we're making progress toward the solution. That's plot progress. Okay, third type of progress, and this I think is applicable to most stories. I would say probably all stories, but it's very, very applicable to fantasy and sci-fi stories, which is kind of my specialty, and probably if you're watching this video is also yours. So the third type of progress in storytelling is world progress. World progress is simply the idea that the audience is gaining an understanding of the setting or the environment or the systems that are at play within your story. So for fantasy and sci-fi, this is your world building. This is your fantastical races, your magic systems, your kingdoms, whatever it be. This is your world building that's injected into your story and that the audience can get a feel for. It's very satisfying if it's done right to learn more about the world. Because another thing that humans like to do, despite the fact that a lot of people, especially young people, might disagree with me, is learning. We humans really enjoy learning just at our core. And so learning about a world or a setting that a story takes place in is one vital type of progress that your story should include. Now, if you're not writing a fantasy or sci-fi story, this might look a little different, but I still think it's applicable. If you're writing a high school drama, getting to know the dynamics of the different friend groups or the different schedules or whatever, that's still world progress that is being made within your story. So it's applicable pretty much everywhere, but it's mainly applicable in sci-fi fantasy, but still, world progress is very important for structuring your stories and making sure that you have world progress within your creative work. Okay, fourth type of progress, and this arguably could be a branch off of the first one, character progress, but the fourth one is going to be emotional progress. Emotional progress, I like to relate to tone. If a movie starts off happy and ends off sad, that's emotional progress. If a movie starts off sad and ends off happy, that's emotional progress. If a movie starts off happy, is sad in the middle and ends off happy, that's still emotional progress. It's the change in tone and the change that your audience wants to, that your audience is feeling, that you want your audience to feel while they're consuming your story. So emotional progress is very, very important, and I think it's often neglected and it's not really thought about in the structuring process. But I think it should be, because think about it. If you are watching a movie or reading a book or watching a television show or whatever, and your emotions are flatlining, you're just sad the whole time, or you don't care the whole time, or you're super excited the whole time, that gets old pretty quick. So emotional progress is that fluctuation, and you have to be considering that. Remember, storytelling is all about progress and all these different areas, including emotional progress. So you need to have that change, and you need to build that into your story fundamentally in order for it to be satisfying emotionally for your audience. Okay. The fifth and final type of progress, and this one is also neglected, but it's very important. This is what separates mediocre stories with very well-written stories. This is thematic progress. Now, this one is a bit more subtle. If it's done right, the audience might not realize that it's happening. But the thematic progress is basically the idea that throughout the story, the audience comes to understand your themes more. Your theme can be all sorts of things. I should do another video talking about theme. But theme is essentially, to boil it down, what you're trying to say on a deeper level with your story. So thematic progress is the idea that throughout your story, your audience gains more of an understanding of what your theme is as the story progresses. So those are the 5 types of progress in storytelling that I've personally, I think are the most important. If you have other ones, please leave them in the comments. And again, there's a lot of branches within those 5 progress types. Now you might be wondering, how does this have anything to do with structuring stories? But let me tell you, you've already begun to develop a way of thinking about stories a little differently. You're thinking about them in terms of progress, which is and making progress as a writer to make your audience feel that progress, which at its core is what storytelling is. And so in order to write and in order to structure good stories, you need to have a basic understanding of this. But now let's get into how we can apply it. This is the pin and string method. So as you can see, we have a string and it has a pin on it, and it's just hanging loosely on a board. I know, very gripping, modern art, right? But we're going to use this string and these pins down there to help us illustrate how we should be structuring our stories. So let's get into it. The first thing that I like to do when I'm trying to figure out, when I'm outlining or when I'm trying to figure out how I want my story to be structured is I just think of what every single story has. No matter how good it is, no matter how bad it is, no matter what kind of structuring system it uses, every single story has a beginning and an ending. So think about your beginning and your ending. Now, if you're in the beginning, like the beginning processes of writing, then you don't have to have a super fleshed out idea of really either the beginning or the ending. Hopefully you have a little bit more of an idea of the beginning, but the ending, at least for me, I oftentimes don't exactly know how my projects end until I get there, at least exactly how they end. I have a vague idea, but until I've written the ending, I'm not exactly sure word for word how it's going to end. But just visualize a vague idea of how you want your story to begin and end. So this pin here that is holding our string in is our beginning. And we don't have much of a story with just a beginning. Our string's hanging pretty loose. And so we need to add a pin to create the ending. Okay, so now we have a line. So you might be wondering, what do these pins and this string represent? The pins represent changes in the status quo. The line represents progress towards the change in the status quo. So if you think about the 5 types of progress in the story: character progress, plot progress, world progress, emotional progress, and thematic progress, between the pins, there should be large differences between these bullet points. And so these are full status quo shifts of our story. And then the driving force in the middle is the progress that's leading us there. So that's how I like to visualize my stories. But this line is kind of boring. It's kind of loose. As you can see, it's very easily moving around. And this isn't very gripping for the audience. We need a tight string for the audience to really enjoy our works. And the progress, though it's there, it doesn't feel very real. Because it's just progress from point A to point B, which is very boring and very basic. And so we want to add a few more pins. So next thing that you want to do when structuring your story is think of where your major status quo shifts are. Now, for me, I always structure my large stories with I structure them into 3 parts. So for example, my book Seas of Grief is split up into 3 parts. It's like if you're reading a book and it starts part 1 and then you read like 10 chapters and then you're in part 2. That's how my books are split up. And they're split up into 3 parts. You don't have to do that, but it makes it easy for me because each part at the very end of the part, a major status quo shift happens. So for me, there's 3 major status quo shifts. Well, I guess 2 major status quo shifts throughout the story, other than the beginning and the end. The beginning isn't really a status quo shift. It's just establishing the status quo. And then the end should be a status quo shift from your beginning. Otherwise, you don't really have a story. So think about your status quo shifts. Now, one thing I'd like to bring up, this should be your major status quo shifts. Things and events in your story that change the course of the story. And if you don't have, or not change the course of the story, but surprise the audience and just big changes are made in each of the 5 areas. Yes, so I personally have 2 big status quo changes in my stories. But again, this method is meant to be moldable. It's meant to fit your style. So if you have more or if you have less, then by all means you apply those status quo shifts as you will. But I'm going to put my 2 extra pins on the board and tighten up our string. Okay, so we got our status quo shifts put, and now our string is not flatlining. It's got a nice curve to it, and it's quite tight. Now, one thing to keep in mind though, this isn't, I don't know if you can see it on the camera, but I can still flop this string around a little bit. This string isn't as tight as we want it to be. The audience it's still a little loose. The audience might get a little bit bored. So we're still not quite done with our story structuring process, but we are getting close. So the next thing to do, you might be tempted when you see that your string is still a little loose, you've added your status quo shifts, you might be tempted if you think, and again, this is a visual representation, but if you think that your story needs more status quo shifts, or in other words, your string is loose, then your first thought might be put more pins on, put a pin here to tighten it up, put a pin here to tighten it up. But really, the more pins you have, the weaker they are. So you can't just fill your board with status quo shifts. And what that would look like in an actual writing setting would be your chapters, every single chapter, some crazy status quo shift happens with all 5 of the categories. That's not a good idea because none of your status quo shifts are going to have very much oomph to them, and that's going to bore your audience. That's almost the equivalent as flatlining because you're always making massive status quo changes. You never are, right? Does that make sense? Hopefully you guys are still following. I don't even know if I'm following myself. Anyway, so what do we do to really tighten up our story? What's the final step in the process? Well, let me do a little segue to talk about pacing. Pacing is something that if it's done wrong, it oftentimes makes a story fall apart. I think we've all experienced it where we get bored in a movie or a movie goes way too fast. And I'm always using the example of movie because I'm a movie guy, but books the same way. You get bored during a book and then you kind of fizzle out while you're reading it, or you read it and you're like, what just happened? These are signs that the pacing of the story could be a little off and need to be tightened up, whether the pacing needs to be slower or faster. The pacing of a story can simply be defined as how long it takes, how often it feels that your status quo is changing, and how much drive you feel that the audience feels that progress is being made. Hopefully that makes sense, and hopefully you're kind of following what pacing is. But the way that I like to think of it, we have our nice little hill here that we've created with our pin and string method. Now, I imagine the audience as just a little car driving along our story like a road. And, we can bring them from the beginning to here. Fine, we have enough momentum to do that. But when we're getting to here, it gets a little tougher. We need something to propel them up this incline here. Now, the car that they're driving has fuel. And this is the metaphor I like to use. Fuel in storytelling, in my opinion, is questions and answers, otherwise known as setups and payoffs. But the idea being that your audience will have questions regarding the 5 areas of storytelling that we talked about earlier. They could have questions about how the world works. They could have questions about whether or not a character is going to get a redemption, whether or not a character is going to survive. These are questions that work as fuel for your audience to drive through your story. And the more fuel they have and the more questions that are getting answered, the less amount of major status quo shifts we need in a story to make it still hit hard and make it still work well with the audience. Now, pacing is something that a lot of the times is considered to be fixed in the editing process. But I'd like to argue that pacing is something that you should be considering from the beginning all the way until the end of your creative process, because it's often overlooked. And so keeping pacing in mind when simply structuring your story could be very, very useful and could save you a lot of time and just make for a better story overall. So with that in mind, when you're writing and when you're structuring your story, just think that if you don't feel like your string is tight enough, like your bullet points of your story you don't feel that you can drive it all the way through. Just think about the questions that you can bring up to your audience to allow them to drive through your story. And these questions can be in any of the 5 categories that we talked about earlier. Just to remind you, that's character, plot, world, emotional, and thematic. All those progress types the audience can have questions for, and those questions will help drive them through as long as they're receiving answers still. That's the thing. If you bring up a question for your audience, you have to answer that question later down the road. Now, we've gotten through all of what I wanted to talk about with the pin method and the strings. I'm hoping that this pin and string method will help creative people out there like myself structure their stories in a way that's still narratively satisfying for the audience, while still being able to think creatively and think outside of the box, which is something that is very, very important for all writers. Again, I purposefully made this very wavy, and it can be interpreted many different ways because that's the way that we create things. We interpret things differently, and we have different perspectives and ideas, and that allows us to think outside the box and create something meaningful. So I hope that I've empowered you to think differently about structuring your stories than a lot of the other stuff out there. So that's where I'm going to wrap up today's video. I really appreciate you watching. I love all you guys. Have a fantastic day.